Imagine a life where your passion becomes your reality, but at what cost? Meet our heroine, a comic book creator so dedicated that she sacrificed sleep to bring her stories to life. But what happens when she dies from exhaustion and wakes up inside her own novel? This is the story of a girl reincarnated as a little princess. If things don't unfold according to the rules of the story, she fears losing her mind and going mad. It was during these events that, for the first time, a handsome blonde butler appeared, introducing himself as her personal servant. His name was Dean, a loyal butler deeply concerned for her well-being. He asked if she had slept well the previous night. Then there was her feared brother, Alan Melvin, the twin of Amy Melvin. Alan was born to be her protector, vowing to keep her safe. As her second brother, a mighty warrior, he pledged to remain by her side until the end. Yet despite all this, Amy couldn't understand how she could live under the same roof as them. Zheng Qinglin, meanwhile, sat at her desk, continuing to work on her comic book. A middle school student and freelance comic book artist, she had been drawing for over 20 hours. Her assistant knocked on the door, offering her medicine. Zhang asked the assistant to leave it on the table, as she was almost finished, and thanked her. The assistant didn't realize that Zhang wasn't afraid of sudden death from exhaustion. Despite working relentlessly, she simply continued. A notification suddenly appeared on Zhang's phone, making her realize how much time had passed. She suggested that her assistant take a nap first, but the assistant responded, insisting that it was Zhang who needed rest. Worried that Zhang might one day collapse from pushing her body too far, the assistant urged her to stop. Zhang, however, dismissed the concern, explaining that her immune system had been weak from birth. In that instant, Zhang was overcome by a sudden fit of coughing, and blood began to appear on her lips. Alarmed, the assistant rushed to her side, urging her to take her medication quickly and prepare to go to the hospital. The assistant kept asking if Zhang could hear her, but Zhang's vision dimmed as she slowly closed her eyes and fell into unconsciousness. When Zhang, now seemingly Amy Melvin, woke up, she felt disconnected from the world, not understanding where she was or who she had become. Suddenly, Dean appeared and asked if she was feeling ill. Overwhelmed by the unfamiliar situation, Amy reacted instinctively, kicking Dean and screaming at him not to come any closer. It seemed like she was missing something. Somehow, she had become the villain of her own comic book, or rather, a young girl in a wealthy family. The story she had created with her own hands was coming to life. It told of the meeting between Deepu's ex-Maina of the Moonflower Kingdom and Prince Kapil. Yet, no story is complete without a villain. In this narrative, Amy Melvin was the ultimate antagonist, the complete opposite of the protagonist. She held a deceptive appearance, high social standing, and, due to her father, the Duke, was willing to do anything to achieve her goals even if it meant breaking her mind and body or staining her hands with sin. Beautiful but dangerous, eccentric but cruel, Amy would stop at nothing. In the end, once her evil deeds were uncovered, she would descend into madness and take her own life, bringing the story to a tragic close. Yet, Zheng Chonglin, who had become Amy in this twisted tale, was not like that. She needed help because, deep down, she couldn't understand the purpose of making her character so malicious. She couldn't think of a better path for her character to follow, and she felt trapped in a story she no longer controlled. The little girl asked who he was, and the butler respectfully replied that he was her humble servant, Dean. He then wondered aloud why she would ask such a question, as if she didn't already know him. Realizing the awkwardness of her earlier reaction, Amy apologized sincerely, trying to ease the tension. She explained that, despite his words, this was the first time she had ever seen him. Dean was so stunned by her response that he was momentarily paralyzed with shock, losing his balance and nearly falling. His mind raced to process what had just happened, and for a brief moment, he froze in confusion. Amy, noticing his dazed state, made a heartfelt plea, asking him not to faint. Her tone was so imploring that it could even calm a frightened bird. The butler, still shaken, asked if he could start by combing her hair and helping her wash up. Amy, with a slight smile, agreed on the condition that he wouldn't cry. Dean finally regained his composure. In the original comic book version, Dean was Amy's personal butler, and when he began taking care of her character, she had an unsettling feeling, though she never showed it to him. But now, As reality and the story blurred, Amy felt an unease she couldn't shake. However, many challenges still lay ahead, especially within the walls of the Duke Melvin's mansion. Later, in the study on the first floor, Dean spoke with Alan, advising him to stay calm. He informed Alan that Amy appeared to be suffering from amnesia, with anxiety clouding her thoughts. Despite Amy's outward strength, Dean noted that some people who appear resilient are actually deeply anxious. Amy, overhearing their conversation, decided to remain silent. Meanwhile, Alan's own memory was processing the situation. Suddenly, he leapt up with an unexpected burst of energy, startling everyone in the room. His sudden movement made Amy flinch, her reaction one of surprise and fear. Alan, however, was overwhelmed with tenderness and joy at seeing his sister again. He moved toward her, arms open, eager to offer her warmth and comfort. He asked, in a hopeful voice, if she would stay by his side, even if she had amnesia. The intensity of the moment was too much for Amy. She screamed so loudly that even a nearby bird would have wanted earplugs. Alan, taken aback by her outburst, quickly apologized, explaining that she had been in a coma for days. His emotions had overwhelmed him, leading to his overly excited reaction, which others in the room found rather intense and unwarranted. Deanie, ever loyal, felt obligated to ask how they should share the information about Amy's condition. Alan, more composed now, reassured him that the important thing was Amy's well-being, and they would deal with the details later. Alan affectionately pecked her cheek and gently stroked her face, clearly happy to have his sister back. For a brief moment, Amy felt herself shudder. It was as if she were under the spell of an incredibly beautiful face. Feeling a wave of confusion and possible danger, she instinctively brushed Alan's hand aside and took a step back. She hid behind Dean, unsure of how to respond to this person who seemed so close yet felt like a stranger due to her supposed memory loss. Dean and Alan both looked at her in surprise, clearly not expecting this reaction. Amy couldn't understand why her emotions were so scrambled. Why did Alan seem both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time? It gradually dawned on her Alan Melvin was her twin brother, a key character in the original novel. According to the story, she had been sent away on her 12th birthday, and the celebration had nearly ended in tragedy. Now, she felt a sharp pang of conscience, as if something about this situation was deeply wrong. Alan, noticing her distress, gently asked if she didn't remember him at all. His voice was full of concern, as he referred to himself as her big brother. But Amy was at a complete loss for words. Mentally, she begged for help, not knowing what to say or how to react. She couldn't understand why she felt trapped and unable to simply run away from it all. Without thinking, Amy turned and bolted, muttering something about having other things to do. She fled, running as fast as she could. Sometimes, a well-timed retreat isn't a sign of cowardice, but a clever way to escape overwhelming problems. Dean watched in astonishment as she sprinted away with incredible speed, marveling at how fast she could run, especially for someone of her delicate stature. Alan turned to Dean and informed him that the master had already returned. Meanwhile, in the corridor on the first floor of Duke Melvin's mansion, the sound of a little girl running echoed down the hallway. Amy, while rushing through, couldn't shake the odd feeling that she had somehow fallen into one of her old comic books, the kind with a Mary Sue heroine. She thought to herself that she had never written anything as cliched as this. Suddenly, she collided with someone. The man she bumped into told her to be more careful. Amy quickly apologized, saying she hadn't meant to run into him. The man, with a teasing tone, asked how anyone could blame such a precious little princess like her. Amy, confused, tried to figure out who this man was. He looked at her and asked if she was all right, mentioning that she appeared tired but still looked delightful and gorgeous. His appearance was strikingly different from the others she had seen so far, elegant, almost of a premium class. He was a character she had neither seen nor written before. Perplexed, Amy asked who he was. Instead of answering, the man gently touched her forehead, and she felt a strange, almost murderous aura surrounding him. Before she could react, the Duke, her father, turned to Kano, filled with a barely contained rage as if he were ready to destroy everything around him. A maid entered the room just then, and Amy, still reeling, didn't understand where all these unfamiliar faces were coming from. The Duke instructed the maid to fetch Dean and Alan, as he wanted to ask them some questions. Everyone was already in the mansion, and he was ready to get to the bottom of things. Without wasting time, the Duke asked directly why his own daughter didn't recognize him and demanded to know what had happened during his absence. Amy sat nervously behind the man, still trying to grasp why the tension had suddenly risen so sharply. She sensed an ominous aura coming from the Duke, and as she pieced things together, she realized that this intimidating man had just referred to her as his daughter, meaning he was her father. Amy stole a glance at him and was shocked to find that he was so young and handsome. She mentally chastised herself for not having introduced this character into her comic book manuscript sooner. Alan exhaled deeply, mentioning Capel, a member of the royal lineage, as he explained what had happened. Amy had mysteriously disappeared from the estate a few days ago. By the time they found her, she had been unconscious and had only woken up a few hours earlier. Dean and Alan kept staring at her, as though expecting something, but Amy couldn't fathom why. She had barely started living this new life and didn't know anything about her supposed past. The young master continued to fidget nervously under his father's intense gaze. The room was filled with awkward silence, the weight of the unspoken words thick in the air. Amy felt increasingly suffocated by the situation and, in her mind, desperately begged for someone to save her from this nightmare. Her distress didn't go unnoticed by Kano, who observed that Amy seemed far too sweet to be handling such pressure. Kano stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Amy's shoulder and suggested, with a polite smile, that the little mistress needed some rest. She subtly hinted that the men should continue their discussion without her for the time being. Taking Amy into her arms, Kano apologized and made it clear that it was not appropriate for the young lady to be subjected to such a conversation in her current state. She assured the Duke that Amy would be taken care of, and with a final smile, Kano and Amy left the room, the doors closing behind them. As soon as the doors shut, the lightness and ease the men had felt while in Amy's presence faded. A sudden coldness filled the room. Duke Ferrer, his expression darkening, turned to Dean and Alan. He demanded to know if, during his absence, Capel had truly broken the law by attempting to kidnap his daughter. Dean, remaining composed, clarified that if the royal family had acted with more determination, the situation might have been different. However, things hadn't unfolded as they had feared. He informed the Duke that this time, Amy hadn't been kidnapped by the royal family at all. Instead, she had disappeared without a trace in broad daylight. He voiced his concern that that person was likely involved, though he didn't specify who. The Duke frowned at this revelation but remained calm. After a moment's thought, he announced his intention to take Amy to the palace for a few days. He wanted to talk to her in private and better understand what had happened while he was away. Though he was relieved Amy was still alive, the lingering question haunted him: who was the child who died in her place? As this troubling thought crossed his mind, the image of Jean Lin appeared, but he wasn't sure how it connected to the situation. Meanwhile, Amy thanked Kano, the maid, for getting her out of the tense room. Kano kindly asked her to call her by her first name, which Amy appreciated. While observing Kano, Amy noticed a small wing near the maid's hair. Intrigued, she couldn't resist the urge to touch it, so she reached out. Kano immediately recoiled and politely but firmly told Amy that her ears were not to be touched. Embarrassed, Amy quickly apologized, explaining that she had thought it was just a piece of jewelry and hadn't realized it was part of Kano's body. Kano then explained that she wasn't human, emphasizing that they were different, which surprised Amy. Though she had expected there would be other races in this world, seeing the reality of it made it all feel more incredible. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Amy realized that waiting around passively wasn't the best approach. She needed to take the initiative. It was time to explore this strange new world herself. In Capel Market Street, District 2, Amy still found it hard to believe that the scene she had drawn in her comic books had come to life. It was like stepping into another world, one she knew intimately, yet it now felt foreign and real. It felt almost like taking a trip abroad, except for one thing: she didn't quite understand why the butler, Dean, was with her the whole time. Amy approached her brother, Alan, and asked if he wanted to go for a walk with her. He agreed, but regretfully explained that he couldn't leave the estate at the moment. Kano and Dean were away, and Alan himself had responsibilities that kept him tied to the mansion. Just then, Dean suddenly appeared, overhearing their conversation. He interrupted, telling them that what Alan had said wasn't entirely true and asked if they were looking for him. He promised Amy that he would make her first outing an unforgettable experience. But strangely, Amy's urge to go outside quickly faded. Dean, noticing the shift, commented that this was the first time Amy had approached him on her own. His tone sounded almost as if he was trying to understand what was going on with her. Amy found their reactions odd. Dean looked gloomy, and Alan seemed unusually upset. Alan, now persuaded, said that he felt it was his duty to keep an incredibly close eye on his sister. He even added, half-jokingly, that if Amy ever became unhappy or upset, he might as well consider his days numbered. Dean understood the gravity of Alan's words and asked for permission to take Amy out on a little date, suggesting they could enjoy the pleasures of shopping and, hopefully, lift her spirits. As a gesture of goodwill, Dean handed Amy a scone, asking if she'd like to try it. Amy thanked him and started eating, finding Dean's enthusiasm to be quite endearing, if a bit over the top. She couldn't quite match his excitement but appreciated his efforts. Dean then asked her to wait for a bit, explaining that there was a new dessert stall nearby, and he wanted to grab something special for her. With a grin, he promised not to take long and reminded her to stay where she was. Amy, amused, playfully remarked that Dean was a bit too windy, always full of energy. Even so, she couldn't help but admire the beauty and coziness of the world around her. Despite the cultural differences from what she was used to, it felt somewhat familiar, not too different from modern times. As she continued enjoying her scone, a sudden scream pierced the air, startling her. Unsure of what had happened, Amy paused, but the scone's taste was too good for her to stop enjoying it completely. She listened closely to the commotion and saw a noble lady nearby, angrily shouting about a brash, inconsiderate commoner. The young man in question was on his knees, apologizing profusely for having soiled the lady's dress. He begged her for forgiveness, his voice heavy with remorse and fear. It seemed as though he feared for his life. The lady, appearing somewhat dramatic, continued to berate him, while the man seemed desperate to escape what he believed was a dangerous situation. Amy watched the scene unfold, somewhat confused. The noblewoman didn't seem particularly threatening to her, but the man was acting as if she held some terrifying power over him. It struck Amy that the young man's reaction was overly intense, almost as if he were the one in the wrong and trying to bake his way out of trouble, possibly even trying to get compensation for the dress. Amy continued to observe, wondering what the real story was behind this strange encounter. Suddenly, the guy grabbed Amy's dress and began begging for mercy. Amy was taken aback, not understanding why this stranger had turned to her for help. There were plenty of adults around, so why her? Perhaps it was because she was dressed plainly and didn't appear to be an aristocrat. As she stood there, bewildered, the noble woman continued to rant, clearly outraged by the whole situation. Amy noticed the woman now seemed curious about her, as if trying to assess her significance. Amy wondered if the lady thought she was the fool of the Duke's family. The woman approached Amy and, with a sneer, remarked that the shabby rags Amy was wearing suited her well. Amy, not knowing where this insult was coming from, retorted that anything would be better than the noblewoman's ridiculous cabbage outfit. The woman was momentarily taken aback, struggling to digest Amy's insult. Recovering quickly, she called Amy a rude, tasteless idiot, declaring herself Mrs. Cabbage in a moment of indignation. Amy, unimpressed, asked if she had anything important to say or if she was just there to waste time. Meanwhile, the guy who had been causing the commotion made his escape, slipping away in a hurry. The noblewoman, still fuming, accused Amy of being a mere puppet, someone who could only stand there in a daze. She taunted Amy, asking why she wouldn't stand up for herself and implying that she'd continue acting like a stray dog if she didn't speak up. Amy, now curious, asked the woman what family she came from, as she couldn't quite place who this rude girl reminded her of. The noblewoman, feeling insulted, introduced herself as Barney, the rising star of society and the feared daughter of Viscount Bale. She declared her name with arrogance, adding that she would only say it once. Amy noted how loud and boastful Barney was and recalled the social hierarchy of this world, dukes at the top, followed by marquises, then earls, viscounts, and, finally, barons. The status of Duke Melvin, Amy's family, was far superior to that of a viscount. Amy couldn't understand what Barney had to be so proud of. She was just a rude, ignorant girl trying to intimidate her. Determined to put Barney in her place, Amy decided to show her what a real villain looked like. Meanwhile, back in Duke Melvin's office, Alan was sitting in thought. He wondered how Amy had been before she lost her memory. She had always seemed empty, like a puppet, easily manipulated by others. Now, though she was more energetic, Alan's habit of worrying about her hadn't gone away. He tried to push his anxiety aside and return to his duties, but his concern for Amy lingered. Back at the market, Barney, still haughty, asked what Amy had just said. She added that Amy's indifferent attitude wouldn't scare her. Amy calmly turned to Miss Bale and remarked that she must be trying to frighten her, but pointed out that her position was much higher than Barney's. Amy's family status, as part of the Duke's lineage, was leagues above that of a Viscount's daughter. Placing her hand on Barney's shoulder, Amy pressed on, asking if she was truly prepared to face the consequences of such disrespect. The intensity of Amy's words hit Barney hard. The noblewoman was stunned, her earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of the sudden realization. Shocked and embarrassed, Barney pushed Amy away, stammering words of apology and begging for forgiveness. She promised not to come near Amy again, and with that, Barney turned and ran off, her face as red as a boiling kettle. Even as she fled, she shouted that Amy should never forget her name, clearly trying to salvage some dignity. Amy, however, remained unmoved, watching the girls retreat with quiet satisfaction. Amy couldn't help but notice the ridiculousness of the situation. Barney had fled so quickly, leaving her in such an awkward position. As Amy stood there, reflecting on what had just happened, she realized she had an observer. Ash had been watching everything closely, his interest clearly piqued by the confrontation. Ash stood quietly, his sharp gaze cutting through the events like a watchful observer. He took in every subtle nuance, carefully noting each detail. From his vantage point, he thought to himself that, thankfully, the kid involved in the earlier commotion wasn't evil. However, he couldn't shake the thought, where was Dean, and why wasn't he accompanying Miss Amy? Out of the corner of his eye, Ash finally spotted the butler and the boy who had caused the ruckus. The boy, nervous and contrite, admitted that he had done everything his master, Dean, had instructed him to do in order to provoke a conflict between Amy and Barney. But, unfortunately, it hadn't gone as planned. Dean, ever the composed schemer, reassured the boy, saying he had done well, but admitted that things had gotten more complicated. Little Amy, he said, isn't as obedient as she used to be. Dean mused aloud that the little loyal knight had discovered him, but added with a sly smile that as long as Amy Melvin was alive, there wasn't much Ash could do. Dean then asked the boy if he was planning to leave soon, warning him that if he didn't go immediately, he might lose the chance to escape later. Ash, growing increasingly angry, wanted to attack Dean right then and there. But before he could act, Dean activated a protective shield. The butler looked at Ash mockingly and asked if he was the rumored guard dog of the Melvin family or just a false knight. With a taunting grin, he asked Ash which title he preferred. Furious, Ash told him to shut up, accusing him of being a mutt of the Imperial Capel family and warning him to avoid doing anything foolish. Dean, unfazed, laughed and said he had expected more praise from Ash. He casually suggested they talk about life next time, since Miss Amy was probably waiting for his return. Meanwhile, Amy stood waiting for Dean, growing more and more confused. Where had he gone? Why was he taking so long, and where was the bread and sweets he had promised to bring her? Suddenly, Dean appeared, apologizing for the delay. Amy immediately asked why he had taken so long and whether he had gotten lost looking for the sweets. But as she looked closer, she noticed something strange. She asked him to bend down slightly, which he did. Amy gently ran her hands over his face and pushed his hair aside, noticing a wound. Concerned, Amy asked where the injury had come from. In the shadows, just behind a wall, Ash remained hidden, watching the scene unfold with a cold, intense gaze. Dean, sensing Amy's worry, explained with a smile that on his way back, he had run into a playful puppy that had tried to steal his food. He took Amy's hand and kissed it softly, teasing her about how sweet she was to worry about him. Amy, stunned by the sudden gesture, felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite place. Her face reflected both her outward uncertainty and the inner turmoil she was struggling to hide. Dean, ever the charmer, stroked her cheek, assuring her that her safety and the well-being of her lovely face was what mattered most to him. His words were tender, but his eyes flicked toward Ash's hiding place, a silent acknowledgement of the hidden observer. Ash, filled with resentment, continued to watch, feeling helpless and frustrated. Dean, on the other hand, only found Ash's reaction amusing, thinking to himself what a funny little guy the knight was. Realizing it was getting late, Dean suggested they return to the estate, reminding Amy that they had an important schedule for the next day. Reluctantly, Amy agreed. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Barney was running down a narrow street, utterly humiliated by the earlier encounter with Amy. She replayed the moment in her mind, still stinging from the embarrassment. No matter how hard she tried, Barney couldn't deny that Amy was strikingly beautiful. But how could she have let the situation spiral so out of control? What was she supposed to do now, especially with the task her father had given her? She didn't know how to proceed. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, something rustled in a nearby dark alley. Startled, Barney turned and saw a silhouette emerge. It was her father, Viscount Bale, who appeared both stern and concerned. "Where's my daughter?" he asked coldly. His servants had reported that after Barney's meeting with Miss Melvin, she had disappeared without a trace. "Barney's just a child," he muttered, his voice softer but filled with pride. "My little girl, she's given me a chance to get closer to Amy Melvin." He smiled to himself, already plotting his next move. His thoughts drifted to when he might settle accounts with the Melvin family, but for now, his focus was on the opportunities his daughter's actions had presented. Late that night, Amy stepped outside for some fresh air. Her mind was spinning with thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that the world she was in had taken on a life of its own. It no longer felt like the comic book she had once drawn, it felt like something far more unpredictable. She didn't know who was pulling the strings, but it was clear she was no longer in control of her own story. At that moment, she looked down and wondered if she would be able to get back up if she jumped from the third floor. Mistress wasn't sure whether to attempt it, as she didn't feel like she belonged there, so she climbed onto the balcony instead. Suddenly, Alan appeared, grabbing her and warning her that it was dangerous, insisting she come down immediately. Sitting together on the floor, holding hands, Amy asked her brother if he was upset with her. He replied curtly that he was, thinking about what could have happened if he had been late. Amy apologized and promised she wouldn't do anything so reckless again, pleading for him to keep holding her with his trembling hands. After all, she wasn't someone he deeply cared for. On the second day, Dean opened the curtains in the young mistress's room and informed her it was time to get up, as she needed to go to the palace to meet His Majesty. Sleepy and disoriented? Still didn't fully grasp the situation. Dean asked if the young gentleman hadn't mentioned it yesterday, but before she could answer, he effortlessly moved her from the bed to the mirror with a skill that impressed her. She remembered how Alan had stopped Amy from jumping off the balcony the previous night, likely too shaken to have mentioned this meeting. Dean then told her that she'd be assigned a bodyguard around her age, so there was no need to worry. He was already waiting outside. Amy stepped out of the room and met Ash. She wondered how someone so young could be a guard for the Lord. Ash greeted the young mistress and introduced himself. She asked him to stand, noting that this character hadn't appeared in her comic book. Ash listened and complied. As soon as she noticed his eyes, she was struck by his heterochromia. Thankfully, he was quite handsome. Suddenly, she sensed a cold gaze on her. Turning around, she looked out the window and spotted a bird staring directly at her. Meanwhile, in another country, Hawaii High Management Bureau's Chenko E stood with a pair of scissors, cutting off her hair. She thought it looked beautiful and was pleased with her skill. Even with short hair, she would still be a beauty. Someone asked if she had packed her belongings as the boat to Kale had arrived. Shuhui responded that she had and was ready to leave whenever needed. She was reminded that this trip wasn't for leisure, she had to remember her mission. Chen Shu reassured them not to worry, as she was dependable. Her task was to capture the monsters that had escaped to neighboring countries. Shen sat and thought, realizing her mission's target was Shunio. She wondered if similar mutants had been found in other countries. It was an intriguing thought. The boatman turned to a little girl, ordering her to come down quickly, as it was dangerous for her to be up there. The girl apologized, and the boatman remarked that they had finally arrived.